Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Everyday Black History. Now, today on Everyday Black History, we're going to be highlighting a former institution rather, that was termed the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau was an agency of the United States Department of War, and the idea behind it was to direct such issues as provision, clothing, fuel, education, any of these things that were deemed needed for the immediate and temporary shelter and supply of destitute and suffering refugees and freedmen and their wives and children. Now, during the Civil War, a refugee was basically a runaway slave. Well, refugees were considered runaway slaves or contraband during that time. So if a fighter from the South ran to the North who was a slave, obviously African American, he was considered a refugee when he went to the North and taken in as contraband. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau came about in the South, and the idea behind it was that they were supposed to work, try and get African Americans and white farmers together. Their powers some of their powers were to help African Americans find family members from whom they became separated during the war. It even arranged to teach African Americans to read and write, which were obviously are considered critical to not only the freed slaves but also to the government as well. Um, it also encouraged former major planters to rebuild their plantations and urged freed blacks to return to work for them, and they were to keep an eye on the contracts between the newly freed laborers and planters and push whites and blacks to work together in the free labor market as employers and employees rather than as masters and slaves. Um, now it was started in March 3rd, 1865, after the war, after the Civil War ended, and it was initiated by President Lincoln, and it was only intended to last for 1 year after the end of the war. It was important during the early part of Reconstruction because, as we mentioned, it assisted the freedmen in the South. But the Freedmen's Bureau, although well-intentioned, wasn't a perfect institution. As we mentioned, it was supposed to solve everyday problems, such as obtaining food, clothing, water, healthcare, and communication with family members and jobs. And between 1865 and 1869, 15 million rations of food were given to freed African Americans and a system was set up, as we mentioned, in which white planters could borrow rations in order to feed freedmen that they employed. And the Freedmen Bureau set aside $350,000 for this service, but only $35,000 was borrowed from planters. So even though it was well intentioned, it still wasn't a perfect system. There was still that racial divide, obviously, because the Civil War had just ended. Medical treatment to the freedmen was severely deficient, as most Southern white doctors and nurses didn't want to work or treat freed slaves. African Americans, the blacks at that time, had little opportunity to develop their own medical personnel, and because of that, epidemics of yellow fever and other diseases at that time were spread around throughout those Freedmen Bureau camps or those contraband camps during that time. But despite that, the African Americans, they persevered during this time and still was able to make it during these hard times. There was also an issue with gender roles, as the Freedmen's Bureau tried to force women to work in the fields along with their husbands, and they tried to insist on contracts that made the whole family, even children, available for field labor in the cotton industry. And so the freed blacks were able to fight against that and to push back on a lot of these issues during that time. The lasting achievement of the Freedmen's Bureau was its progression in education. Before the Civil War, it was illegal for blacks to learn how to read and how to write. And of course, freed slaves had a strong desire to learn how to read and write, and some had already started schools at refugee camps, and others worked hard to establish schools in their communities even before the Freedmen's Bureau was created. By 1866, Um, aid societies such as the American Ministry Association, which we covered before, they helped to establish 11 colleges in southern states for the education of freedmen and former slaves. And Congress even appropriated funds to operate these schools. And a lot of these schools, the revenue came from a congressional act that gave the Freedmen's Bureau the power to seize Confederate property for educational use. Um, 11 colleges, as we mentioned, well known colleges that we even covered here on Everyday Black History, such as Fisk University, Clark Atlanta, Howard University, um, Shaw University, Dillard University, or St. Augustine's College. All these were universities that were started um, with the help or that was started through other organizations that were influenced and inspired by the Freedmen's Bureau. There's a lot of information on the Freedmen's Bureau, and I suggest if you have an opportunity to look it up, because there's so much information that it could take us close to an hour to actually cover it. But we wanted to highlight it because it did have some good and some bad for the African American community when it was around. It was only around for a few years, from 1865 to the 1872, and of course we know, um, you know, during Jim Crow was started after that. So when the Democrats took power at that time, because Democrats and Republicans would switch, when the Democrats took power at that time, and they stopped, blacks from voting, and they, created all these Jim Crow laws, as we know of, to keep us down. We know that all happened after the advent of the Freedmen's Bureau. But despite all that throughout history, um, the colleges were able to be started because of it, and a lot of good things did happen, even though there were bad things as well. So we just wanted to highlight it because it is an important part of Black history. So we won't salute the Freedmen's Bureau, but we will highlight it here on Everyday Black History because it is important to our history and our culture. So that concludes this episode, and please tune in again. As we have plenty of videos on the YouTube channel. Please, we also have a podcast as well, Everyday Black History, that you can find on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, and anywhere else that you may listen to podcasts. So please continue to support Everyday Black History and stay tuned for the next episode.